Okay, once again, we like to turn to 2 Kings chapter 5. Read first 4 verses. 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. Now Naaman, captain of the host of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master, and honorable, because by him the Lord had given deliverance unto Syria. He was also a mighty man in valor, but he was a leper. And the Syrians had gone out by companies, and had brought away captive out of the land of Israel a little maid, and she waited on Naaman's wife. And she said unto her mistress, Would God my Lord were with the prophet, that is in Samaria, for he would recover him of his leprosy. And one went in and told his Lord, saying, Thus and thus said the maid that is of the land of Israel. This, of course, is just a portion of the account of the healing of Naaman. As we saw earlier, we see there's some information concerning the person of Naaman in verse 1, ending with his condition, that is, he was a leper. In verse 2, we are told of a little maid in Naaman's household. She is there by the providence of God. The words little maid, the word little there does not stress her stature, but probably signifying that she may have been of little stature, but signifying that she was but a girl, a very young girl. And in this message, we want to take notice of this little maid. And what we know about her is recorded only here in verses 2 and 3. Nothing else is ever said of her. Only in this account of Naaman do we read of her, and most, when they read the account, pay very little attention to her. Again, the only information we have concerning her is what is recorded here in verses 2 and 3. And we see in those verses that she's from the land of Israel, a young girl. She was taken captive. As a result, she waited on Naaman's wife. She became a servant in their household. And one day she said something. And that's all we know about her. So again, reading the account, most give very little attention to her. But the truth is, she plays an enormous and significant role in this account of Naaman being healed. And more importantly, she serves as an example and encouragement to God's people. We need to take to heart some of the lessons that are found in this little maid. Our subject this morning is replicas of a little maid. We need to be like her. Told very little about her, but what we're told serves as an example. So let's look first of all at the history behind this little maid. And this is recorded briefly and vaguely in verse 2. We see, again, read verse 2, and the Syrians had gone out by companies and had brought away captive out of the land of Israel a little maid, and she waited on Naaman's wife. So one day in Israel, there was a raid of soldiers from across the border. These Syrian soldiers come swooping down, and this girl was torn from her home. We do know that of her. We do not know the details. The actual details of the event are not given. One can imagine many a scenario, but we don't know. We do not know what transpired on that awful day for her. Maybe she was out picking berries when a soldier jumped out from behind the bushes and grabbed her and took her away. We don't know. Perhaps her parents were killed before her eyes. Again, we don't know. Did the Syrians torch her house? Again, we do not know. The precise details of her being taken are not given. All that it says is that she was brought away captive out of the land of Israel. And as a result, now she waits on Naaman's wife. So there she is. She is simply a part of the spoils of a victorious army. The Syrians marched into Israel, and as her captors head toward Damascus with her, as she snatched away from her home, her life was changed. Her life would never be the same. Gone were the ways in which she was familiar. It's all gone. And ahead, all things are foreign. Foreign land, foreign gods, foreign customs, foreign language, etc. She's taken captive, carried away by the soldiers. And there was something in her appearance and perhaps her actions that commended her to Naaman. And he selected her to be a part of his household. And she became servant to Naaman's wife. Torn from her family. And she waited on Naaman's wife. Her life that day was shattered by tragedy. Uprooted from her home and her family by an enemy army and carried off into a strange land. Everything's different now. And she's in a place, she's in a set of circumstances that she did not expect, that she did not plan for, something she would have never chosen. And she now has to endure a life of service in the house of an enemy. She's basically trapped in a life that she cannot leave. This, of course, would be a tremendous trial and an affliction in her life. And again in verse 2, humanly speaking, it was all without rhyme or reason. Why did it happen? There's no rhyme, there's no reason. Simply says, brought away captive out of the land of Egypt. Wrapped up in those words are tears and tragedy. Brought away captive out of the land of Egypt. But in it all, we must recognize the providence of God. By the providence of God, we simply mean God working His plan and purpose. God has a plan, God has a purpose, and when God, He always does, when He works that plan and purpose, that is simply the providence of God. It's what we read in Proverbs 16:33. The lot is cast into the lap, but the whole disposing thereof is of the Lord. That's God's providence. God is sovereign. He has a purpose. He has a plan. And He works His purpose. He works His plan. And it was no accident that she was carried away captive out of the land of Egypt. It was not just some misfortunate event that this little maid is now in the house of Naaman. In Proverbs 19:21, there are many devices in a man's heart. Nevertheless, the counsel of the Lord, that shall stand. Things don't just happen. God is in control. We can't explain it all. And the reason is we don't need to. We just have to believe that God works all things after the counsel of His own will. There is a God, and He's in control. Many would have you to believe there is a God, but man's in control. No, there is a God, and He's in control. It wouldn't be God if He weren't in control. In our text, and God often does this, God would use evil to bring about His purpose. Remember what Joseph said to his brothers in Genesis 50 and verse 20. His brothers had sold him into slavery. But as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good to bring to pass. God can make the sinful acts of men praise Him, and He does. Again, Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9, my thoughts are not your thoughts. Well, why was this little girl taken away captive? Why? My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither your ways my ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. This little maid in the house of Naaman finds herself in a very dark set of circumstances. But the truth is, God, by His all-wise providence, has placed this little maid in the house of Naaman. She is there for a God purpose. Now God knew, of course, that Naaman would become a leper. And He knew that He would send Naaman to Elisha to be healed. And God, in His all-wise, incomprehensible providence, places this little maid in the house of Naaman to be an instrument that he would use in the life of Naaman. She knew nothing of that. God may place you in many places, many set of circumstances. You may never know why. You don't need to know. All you need to know is God's in control. So, though this little maid may appear to be very insignificant in the overall account, God in His providence has placed her there to be a witness, to be a testimony before Naaman and his family, and to inform them of Elisha and the cure. And God places us in the midst of spiritual lepers. And God places us in the midst of adverse circumstances. And He does so for the same reason, that we would be a witness and testimony for the Lord. Be careful that you do not forget that God is always working His purpose. Always working His plan. Be careful that you do not misrepresent God's providence. You see, God had determined to bless Naaman. And He puts this witness in his life. And that witness was this little maid. God placed her there. Be careful that when you do not understand God's providence, and we often do not, and even when we do, we don't understand it all, that you do not become discouraged or bitter. But remember the truth. God's working His plan. God's working His purpose, and all things work together for the good to them who love God and to them who are called according to His purpose. So she's there for a God reason. She is there for a God purpose. That is true of you and I as well. So now let's look at the behavior and spirit of this little maid. Here's a girl. She's been snatched away from a home where no doubt she had been raised and nurtured under the influence of God and His Word. She knew all about Elisha. And now she seems to be doomed to a life of slavery, away from her family, away from her home. And again, all the sadness and the tears wrapped up in those words, brought away captive out of the land of Israel. So again, there she is in a set of circumstances I'm sure she never imagined. She's in a place, she's in a set of circumstances that she would have never chosen. She's in a place, she's in a set of circumstances to no doing of her own. It happened suddenly. Wasn't something she could plan for. There are a lot of things that you cannot plan for in life, no matter how hard you try. So this was a trial. This was a difficulty for this little maid. And we can learn a lot from her in this trial. In this trial, she maintained faith in God. From what she said in verse 3, she had She says, would God, my Lord, the Lord being Naaman, were with the prophet that is in Samaria. She had faith in God. She was mindful of God. She did not blame God or anybody else for the situation that she was in. She did not allow circumstances to cause her to lose sight of God. From what she said in verse 3, she's still very mindful of the truth that she knew, the truth that she had been taught. Now, perhaps there were times when Naaman's wife would have taken her to the house of Rimnon, their god, and she would look around and see the senseless idols. And this little maid would think along the lines of the psalmist in Psalm 115, verses 3 through 8. They have ears, but they hear not. They have eyes, but they see not. Tongues, but they speak not. And on and on. The point is, she was able to look through her circumstances and feelings and see God. There are a lot of God's people who are unable to do that. They do not seem to have the ability to look beyond their circumstances and see God. She did that. In this trial, she also remained faithful. Now, faithfulness is not the same as faith. It's a result of faith. It's a life that results from faith. Because she was mindful and because she was focused upon God and the truth, she was able to rise above natural feelings. Again, she's in a terrible set of circumstances, in a place that she would have never chosen. And I'm sure there were times when she sobbed on her bed at night. It doesn't appear that she was given over to sulkiness or self-pity. Doesn't take much for a lot of God's people today to be given over, to be overtaken with sulkiness and self-pity. Doesn't seem to have happened to her. Obviously, she's not overcome with anger or hatred or bitterness or resentment. She's been torn from her family, carried away into a native land by the Syrian soldiers. Yet we do not find her cherishing and feeding a spirit of vindictiveness or revenge. If feelings of retaliation had sway over her, she would have watched with malicious pleasure the progress of Naaman's leprosy. She might have said something, serves them right, God's punishing them. That wasn't the case. God's grace was upon her. And she drew from His strength. And she did not render evil for evil. You see, she's been put in a situation that put her under the biblical obligation to love her neighbor as herself and to love her enemies. She's been put in a place where she's now got the opportunity to practice that. God may put you in a place so that you can practice Love your enemies. Love your enemies. Bless them that spitefully use you. Bless them that curse you. That's the place where she is. God may put us in a place where we can practice Romans 12:17. Recompense to no man evil for evil. She's in that place. And she did not think to herself, as she looked at Naaman, well, I know where there's hope for him, but after what he's done, I'm not going to help him. Not after what he's done. But rather than that, it appears that she had pity and sorrow in her heart as she watched Naaman suffer with the disease of leprosy. How was she able to do that? Because her focus is upon God. She never lost sight of God. As a result, she has a burden of heart for Naaman. Consider your enemies, those you don't like. Oh, I love everybody. Don't lie. There are people you don't like. There are people you can't stand. Consider them. Do we have a burden for the salvation of their soul? Or do we say things like, I don't see why God doesn't just strike them? It's amazing God doesn't strike us when we have that attitude. Are we able to look at those who are polar opposite and have a burden of heart for them? She also manifested a generous and loving spirit toward the enemy of her country. She wanted good for him. Is that us? Could God have prevented her from being taken away from her home by the Syrian soldiers? Of course he could have. Was it a terrible thing that happened to her? Well, of course it was. Did she understand the why of her situation? I doubt it. Would she have rather been home with her family? Well, of course she would. Was this something that brought joy into her life? I don't think so. And if she would have hated Naaman and been bitter toward him, there would have been people who would have thought she's justified to have hatred for Naaman. We're never justified to have hatred because we're to love our enemies. She maintained faith in God. She remained faithful in her circumstances. And in spite of her circumstances, she did what God would have her to do. There she is in a place she would not have chosen. And you may find yourself in a place that you would have never chosen to be. The question is, what would God have me to be and do in this situation? I would much rather be somewhere else, but that's not the issue. That's not where I am. What would God have me to do? It's simply this: circumstances do not dictate behavior. God is to dictate our behavior. So let's consider, she's in these adverse circumstances. Consider the witness of this little maid. Again, there are those words. Brought away captive out of the land of Israel. And she waited on Naaman's wife. Brought away captive out of the land of Israel. Oh, the emotion that is wrapped up in those words. But though a captive and exile among the enemies of her God and her nation, and no doubt she often yearned for her home, she also had a yearning to glorify God where she was. It's one thing to yearn to be somewhere, but if you forget why you're where you are, that's not good. She has a yearning to glorify God. And she has a yearning to be a witness of His grace and His truth. God, in His all-wise providence, has placed her in the land of an enemy. He has placed her in the house of Naaman. And He has done so for His own glory. And He has done so for the sake of Naaman. But He has also done so for us. God not only placed this little maid in the house of Naaman for Naaman, He placed her there for us as a shining example of what we ought to be and do. Regardless of circumstances, regardless of place, we are to glorify God, and we're to bear witness of Him. And we don't do that if we're overtaken with sulkiness and self-pity and anger and bitterness. And this little maid, as insignificant as she appears, she's an example to us. She's like Jeremiah. In Jeremiah 20, verse 9. The truth that burned within her heart was just like Jeremiah. But the word was in mine heart as a burning fire shut up in my bones, and I could not stay or refrain. I could not be quiet. There's a lot of things that people can't be quiet about, but the Lord's not one of them. When she saw the suffering of Naaman, she could have kept secret that there was hope and a way of restoration. She could have kept secret the one who had the answer for Naaman's dilemma. But though it was Naaman's army that had carried her from home, listen as she speaks. Would God. It's an expression of desire. Would God, my Lord, that is Naaman, were with the prophet that is in Samaria, for he would recover him of his leprosy. The Word of God is in her heart, and she's ready to share, even with an enemy. She's in Naaman's house, a captive. But she's acting as a sign pointing Naaman to his only hope. Wherever we are, God places us there to be a signpost of man's only hope. Well, I don't want to be there. Doesn't matter. You are. And you're there for a reason. A God reason. And again, though it was Naaman's army that carried her from her home and family and all that was familiar and dear to her, would God, my Lord, were with the prophet. She displays no vindictiveness toward Naaman. But instead, she's yearning in her heart for his welfare. Her heart yearns for him. The enemy of her people. Her heart yearns for him to be blessed. That needs to be us. You know how rare that is? Again, God has determined to bless Naaman by curing him of his leprosy. And this little maid, who appears so insignificant, God puts her as a witness in Naaman's life. She's a wonderful example of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 26 through 29. Turn there if you will. 1 Corinthians 1, verses 26 through 29. For you see your calling, brethren, how that not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called. But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. And base things of the world, and things which are despised hath God chosen, yea, and things which are not, to bring to naught things which are, that no flesh should glory in His presence. That was this little maid, and that is us. There she is, a God-placed witness. We need to view our life through that lens. I am a God-placed witness. Wherever it is that God places, we're there as a witness. Whatever the circumstances might be, whether it's circumstances you would have chosen or not chosen. Whether it's good circumstances or bad circumstances, none of that is the issue. Wherever you may find yourself, and among whomever you may find yourself, remember, you're there as a God-placed witness. A God-placed signpost. This little maid serves as a reminder of our position in the world and in our circumstances, whatever they might be. You see, there's God's people today who have convinced themselves that they have a right to sulk. That they have a right to be drowned in self-pity. After all, if you've experienced what I do, you'd feel sorry for yourself too, they say. You have no right to sulk. You have no right to drown yourself in self-pity. Well, I have every right to be angry. No, you don't. God hasn't given you the right to be angry. Well, they did such, it doesn't matter. God has placed us to be a witness. Isaiah 43:10, the Lord said to Israel, ye are my witnesses. And in Isaiah 43:12, ye are my witnesses, saith the Lord, that I am God. That I am God. John 15:27, And ye also shall bear witness, because ye have been with me from the beginning. We are witnesses of God. We are witnesses for God. What is a witness? Well, a witness is one who testifies for another. We are to testify for God. A witness tells what they know. A witness tells what they have seen, what they have heard, what they have experienced. We are his witnesses. Well, but you don't understand. I'm in a situation. It doesn't matter. That's not the issue. You're his witness. A witness is one who attests to, one who confirms, one who gives evidence or verifies or demonstrates and reveals. So as witnesses of God, we should view our circumstances as opportunities to bear witness and testimony. Again, it may be a situation you would have never, ever chosen. But that's not the issue. We need to realize why we're there. We should view our circumstances as opportunities. Notice Paul's attitude regarding his circumstances. Philippians chapter 1, verse 12. But I would ye should understand, brethren, that the things which happened, just look at those words, the things which happened, all the things which have happened in our lives, the things which happened unto me, the things which happened unto me. Person sulks, feels sorry for themselves, always depressed, always down in the dumps. And their attitude is, well, it's all because of the things which happened to me. No, it's not. He works all things according to his will. Wherever we are, we're there to be a witness of God. That needs to be our viewpoint. We may find ourselves later this day or tomorrow in the hospital. I'm not planning on going to the hospital. And I certainly am not going to choose to go to the hospital. But I may find myself in the hospital. And if I do, I'm to be a witness for God. Well, I don't want to be here. That's not the issue. That's not the issue. The issue is, why are you here? You know, people say all the time, and I believe they use it as an excuse, but, well, I just don't know why I'm here, whatever the here is. Well, if you read your Bible, you do know why. You're there for a witness. You're there for a witness. That's all it is. This little maid, she doesn't have silver, she doesn't have gold. And even if she had, they would have been of no avail to Naaman's plight. But there was something she could do. She could tell him, well, she told his wife, of a hope. With just a few simple words. And God caused, she spoke those words, would God that my Lord, with the prophet. And when she spoke those words, God caused one to take notice of those simple words. And they were repeated. In the ear of another servant who went and told Naaman, that little maid, she said thus and thus. And Naaman, wanting to be cured, now knows there's hope. All because God placed a little girl, a little maid, in Naaman's house. God places each of us in a variety of circumstances. And God places each of us amongst a variety of people. We're not all set in the exact same circumstances. We're not all set amongst the exact people. But God places His people all around the world in circumstances and places amongst people to bear witness. And you realize, people all the time say, well, it's not possible to spread the gospel throughout all the world. Oh, it is. It's very possible. If each of God's people would just do what they're called to do. In every given place, in every given circumstances, to bear witness. The witness would be worldwide. No, it's not possible now when God's people just keep their mouths shut and sulk all day. But that's not why we're here. God didn't call us to sulk and to be angry. God called us to be a witness. None of us know when our last day is going to arrive. But wouldn't you rather spend your last day being and doing what God has called you to do, or would you rather spend your last day sulking and being angry? We don't know when our last day is. So I would advise, don't feel sorry for yourself. Don't sulk. Don't spend the day in anger. Don't convince yourself how justified you are to do all those things. Do what God has placed you here to do. To be a witness. To be a witness. And you try sometime talking to somebody who has chosen to spend their life sulking and has chosen to spend their life angry and bitter, and you try talking to them. You are now public enemy number one. How dare you take away my sulkiness? How dare you try to take away my anger? God help us to realize why we're here. To be a witness of God. And we do that two ways, and they go together. By our life and by our word. By our life, by our attitude, by our spirit, and by speech. So God help us the next time we find ourselves in a place and in a set of circumstances that we wish were not so, that we would realize there's a God in control. And He's placed us there for a God purpose. And it ought to be our desire to fulfill that God purpose. Brother Ben, if you'd come and lead us in a